Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Bendicion wash processed Ecuador from Acid Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Acid, based out of Tokyo, Japan. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the La Papaya, a different wash processed Ecuadorian coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that the owner of Ondo reached out to us asking if we'd be interested in purchasing a couple of Acid's mejorado coffees. And of the two that we did purchase, this is the one that interested me a little more. And that's largely because this is a mejorado that we're yet to review from any coffee roaster. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This one is also in line with our previous experience with Acid, which we described as being a true medium by most standards and metrics, as this one is also notably more developed than we've had from any other Japanese-based coffee roaster up to this point that I can remember. A lot of Japanese-based coffee roasters do also roast in this pretty medium developed profile as well. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression through the V60, and I had the same two takeaways from this coffee that I did from the La Papaya, as it came out super sweet, but also notably more developed. But the trade-off definitely felt worth it due to the prominent sugary fruit sweetness, as the listed apple jam felt like the most apt descriptor. In addition to that, some roasty and citric qualities also felt, but this one was mostly just super sweet. And I do have to say that of the two, I actually enjoyed this one more off the first impression, as I found that apple jam to be a much better representation than the apple notes, the green apple notes that they had listed for the other one, largely because this one just had such a very strong, super sugary sweet aspect to it, even more so than the other coffee, that I enjoyed it just a little bit more based off of that first impression. And honestly, when I was going through these coffees, I was looking forward to trying this one out a little bit more than I was that one each time we brewed them. Day 18, through the Chemex, and there was a pretty similar sentiment this time around, as the coffee does offer an abundance of sweetness and roastiness, with the roasty qualities being even more prominent and intense today. And that's going to be a little bit of a consistent theme when it came to the Chemex with this coffee specifically, as the trade-off does offer an almost peachy and sweeter but also well-defined citric quality to it. So it did seem like there were some nice traits that did come from brewing this one with the Chemex, but outside of that, I didn't know if I necessarily enjoyed just how much roastiness there was in this one compared to the first day that we had of it. Day 21 through the April brewer, and there's been some nice consistency to this coffee, as it does remain super sweet. This time a little bit more of a honeysuckle feel, with the apple-like qualities presented yet again. Higher level of brightness as well, with the caramelized sweetness and some slight roastiness yet again. So I think what I found from this coffee was it offered a little bit more depth and definition, at least based off these first couple of impressions to it. And as a result, I continued to enjoy this coffee a little bit more than the La Papaya. Day 24 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, 93 degrees Celsius at a 15:1 concentration. And the coffee is seeing a little bit more of a smoky sense to it than the previous days. So between the two, this one at times could feel a little bit more in terms of that roasty quality. But even then, both of them did have it the entirety of the time that we were working with them. Still interestingly high on the brightness though, which was the other big takeaway I did have, as there's a lot of those strong apple-like components to it, but not quite as much depth, as I wouldn't necessarily say there was any more of that honeysuckle or peach component that we'd experienced from earlier. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee does continue to remain pretty consistent overall, as it feels like the coffee has both peaked and won't really improve from this point going forward, which is kind of interesting given that I felt the sentiment a little earlier with this coffee than I did with the La Papaya. It still does offer plenty of the caramelized mejorado-like qualities to it, otherwise prominent sweeter citric qualities with plenty of brightness yet again. Day 30 through the V60 was our standard recipe, and there were some of the similar issues that we had with the La Papaya, as it is offering that slightly vegetal feel to it with the roastiness taking over. Neither coffee really did improve with time, as this time it felt like a significantly more burnt caramelized feel to it. So in the same way that we opted for the Chemex with the La Papaya as our brew guide, this coffee we opted for the V60 mostly because that's the best experience we had with this coffee on the day that we brewed it, which was that, day 24 mark. So actually it was even earlier than that, I would say was our first impression of this coffee. So it was kind of tricky within this one and kind of comparing these two coffees alongside each other because this one seemed to fall off a little earlier. It also seemed to be a little bit more developed. I shouldn't say that, but it seemed to offer a little bit more roastiness to it. And outside of that, it also offered a little bit more depth. So there were positives and negatives to both of these coffees. And then day 33 through the V60 with our standard recipe. Final notes we have, as it feels like the trade-off of this coffee has likely dropped off with a little bit less of the overall, we'll say, caramelized sweetness to it. There's still an abundance of the listed citric qualities to it, but a bit more roastiness with a notable level of brightness to it as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s. I feel like they're probably the same as the other coffee, but let's go through them real quick. We will start with the finish and sweetness level 4. I mentioned the same thing with the La Papaya. It's a very sweet coffee, and that's the biggest selling point to me on these coffees. The sweetness did come in a similar sense. They both had that strong caramelized, sugary sweetness to them, but this one right here, that apple-like sweetness was presented a little bit more in an intense sense. So I think the big description difference that they do have is apple jam versus green apple, and I can kind of see that the other apple component to the La Papaya was maybe a little bit more bright in that sense and a little bit more tart, whereas this one right here felt a little bit more sugary in general. So that's going to be a really big difference on that. Outside of that, there's still plenty of brightness to this one, and if I had to compare the two side by side, I would actually say this coffee felt a slight bit brighter than that one for the majority of the time that we were working with it. This one definitely had slightly higher highs and slightly lower lows when comparing the two coffees alongside each other, which I think was kind of worth the trade-off for me because for that reason I enjoyed this coffee on certain days significantly more than the La Papaya. And let's go ahead and move on to the citrus fruit level 4. And in the same way with the La Papaya, all the notes they had listed on there were citric notes in a sense. I feel like this is the same: apple jam, pineapple, and I think this time it's grapefruit. And given there's a slight bit of tartness to this as well, and maybe not quite as intense of a sweetness in terms of that citric quality, I could say that I can definitely see that. The sweetness for this one was much more of a sugary sense to it as opposed to that kind of caramelized sense that was presented within the La Papaya. So level 4, we're opting to put that in a slightly more sugary apple-like sense. Let's go ahead and move on to the level 3s, and we will start with the chocolate level 3. I'm kind of looking at this tasting wheel and saying florality level 2, that's very low. But there was honeysuckle earlier, and I could justify that at the level 3 mark, but on the final day we were brewing that in level 2s where we opted to put it. Chocolate level 3, same thing, a little bit of that darker chocolate aspect given that it is a fair bit more of a developed coffee, and that's usually the case when I'm working with a coffee like this, is that it gets that more traditional feel to it. Caramel level 3, I feel like that's a very interesting one given that the La Papaya did score that level 4, though this coffee did seem to drop off a little bit earlier than that, but I think I really wanted to kind of demonstrate a lot of the differences between these two coffees. Is this one right here was maybe not as caramelized as the other coffee, and it was maybe not as floral as the other coffee, but it was made up for in other aspects. As you can see, the smokiness is also scoring there at the level 3. We'll actually hold off on that till last. The other two things really worth highlighting within this coffee compared to the La Papaya is that the savoriness is toned down on level 2, as it also seems to have a little bit of that celery quality, but it wasn't quite as prominent as it was in the La Papaya. So level 2, where we opted to put that. Body level 3, it did have a little bit more texture to it, and again, it could be a result of us brewing this one with the V60 where the La Papaya was with the Chemex. So that's the big difference there. And then the final thing we're discussing is the same thing we discussed with the La Papaya. Cleanliness level 3, smokiness level 3. This one also a very developed coffee, and I would say just notably more smoky than the La Papaya, but not to the extent where it justified scoring higher than that level 3. It's still pretty rare that we scored too many coffees even there at that level 3 mark in terms of the smokiness. There has been at least one coffee this year where we scored that level 4, but they're so rare and they happen so infrequently that whenever we do get something that's, we'll say, this smoky, I think it's just kind of difficult to place it anywhere above a level 3 given that we have had coffees just, we'll say, more developed than that, you know, your darker roast coffees in general. So level 3 where we opted to put that, and that of course will hinder the overall cleanliness, keeping it there at that level 3 mark, as even though there are some really nice defined qualities to this one as well, it is going to be hindered by that overall smokiness to it. So as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like I went through a lot of those impressions throughout this review as I'm kind of comparing these two coffees side by side. This one had a little bit more higher of a high, and this one had a little bit more lower of a low, and it did seem to drop off a little bit quicker than the other coffee, but at the same time, it didn't seem to drop off as drastically as the other coffee. So for that reason, I would say that I probably enjoyed this coffee a slight bit more, but I was also a bit more excited to work through this coffee a little bit more given the lack of familiarity with this specific mejorado. So for that reason, I could say just a slight preference towards this one. The way that they were presenting themselves were both pretty interesting. Both of them were in line with what I would expect for a slightly more developed mejorado coffee. So for that reason, I really enjoyed the experience I did have with this coffee roaster, even if neither of these two are going to be anywhere near my favorite mejorado coffee that we have reviewed this year. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, right along the lines of the La Papaya that we'd reviewed, as well as this one does take on that more traditional approach to it as well. Also offering a little bit more body, also offering a little bit more of those traditional aspects to it, that slightly more developed roasty quality to it, a little bit more of that darker chocolate aspect, a little bit more of that caramelized feel to go with a very strong and intense sugary and fruit sweetness that is presented within this coffee and throughout the entirety of it. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the La Bendicion wash processed Ecuador from Acid Coffee. Thank you for watching.